at the LSE. So my name is Ricky Burdett. I'm the director of a research center here called LSE Cities. And the reason I'm here is because Anne and I have been co-conspirators in favor of cities for some time. So we're very, actually, that's why you were one of the people who said, why don't you join the LSE? And I asked, what is the LSE? And you can see I'm an architect, wearing black round neck. That's how it works. And in fact, it was Anne who did introduce me to Bruce Katz a number of years ago in a project that we were involved in for many years together called The Urban Age. And therefore, Mark, you're the new kid on the block as far as we're concerned, but it's wonderful that you're here. So this event today is a discussion on leveling up and comparing very different experiences, I think we can already say, between what's happening in the United States and what's happening in the UK. And we have Bruce Katz, who's going to give the first presentation around half an hour on the really quite amazing levels of investment happening in the States over the last number of years in leveling up initiatives, effectively coming from very, very different angles. And then we will have two shorter sort of commentaries, feedback more from the UK perspective from Anne and Mark. Then we'll open it up for discussion, Q&A. We're going to record the main event, the main presentation, but we won't record the Q&A. So that allows you to be even more aggressive or critical. But when we come to that, it's very good if you could just tell us who you are, whether you're affiliated to another an institution, and keep your questions short, please. That would be good. We aim to end by 5 o'clock, and you're all welcome to have drinks here and chat to the speakers and to yourselves when we've finished. So it's an hour and a half, but it continues. Just very, very briefly, I won't necessarily go into the themes, because I think the description is very clear that the leveling up agenda is something that has grabbed sort of national or controlled and determined very significant changes in policy which are affecting cities in our different countries in very, very different ways. You know, maybe we're regretting the fact that we're talking about England versus US as opposed to US versus Europe, because we're no longer part of that. And I think it's a different story in other parts of the European continent. We're very involved at LSE Cities in looking at European cities at the moment, so you might want to contribute to that. But in order to really give us a story, a narrative, an interpretation of what's happening in the US, there can't be anyone better than Bruce Katz. I mean, Bruce has been shaping discussions, research, policy in America for 30 years, probably, something of that order, both at the White House level, but also in different institutions here. He set up and ran the very important, very influential metropolitan program at Brookings, and then a number of years back with colleagues set up the new center, effectively, now called the Novak Metro Finance Lab. Is that the right term? Yes. At the Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation at Drexel University in Philadelphia. You know, this is one of the cities where many of the issues we're talking about, social exclusion, spatial inequality, is literally played out in front of your eyes, and that's also, you know, very important. I have to say, Bruce, the first times I came across you were effectively giving the pre-speech, the warm-up act for a guy called Gordon Brown, when Gordon Brown was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so 2004, and it was the 100th. It was the centenary of the Roundtree Foundation. And I think you put on the table a number of issues around social exclusion and who was affected by it in cities in a way that was very, very sort of important and influential. And Gordon Brown followed up to a degree. So Bruce will speak first and comes from, you know, that extraordinary sort of background and experience. I mean, and power equals housing, full stop, as far as I'm concerned. And all the issues to do with housing, not just here at the LSE in the Department of Social Policy, Stickard, now an emeritus professor, created some of the most important initiatives around understanding the housing and the needs of the people who live in housing, not just the mortar, the bricks, and the rules, which is something I'm very interested in. And I think that's where we dialogued and collaborated in an important way. Even one of the initiatives we happened to work together, which was the Urban Task Force, with the architect Richard Rogers a number of years ago. She will be talking, I think, in part about the levelling up agenda and how it affects London. I mean, you might even could say that the levelling up agenda in this country is anti-London. I mean, you could just start from that, and let's debate perhaps that issue. Mark is, as you know from the sort of the summary here, is a senior lecturer at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at Oxford, University of Oxford, but is also a visiting fellow here at the International Inequalities Institute at the school. So it's good that you are here, not all the time, but part of the time, but very much part of this dialogue. So I'd like to just ask Bruce to start, give your presentation. It is full of data and images and much more. When he comes to a slide which says that the total amount of money being invested in levelling up in the States is 2.3 trillion, right? I've seen the slides. That's 2,300 billion. Just remember that. So 2,300 billion dollars. I can't work out what the UK government is investing, but it ain't anything like that. But I mean, so just remember that number. But could you all welcome our wonderful panel?
So just to start, I'm joined by a friend, Tom Osha, who works as the chair of the Global Institute on Innovation Districts, which you'll see a bit of that in my presentation, based in Cincinnati. We've been in college for a long time, so Tom at some point will tell you what he's up to. I first of all just want to thank Ricky for that introduction, and really for engaging me at LSE going back 20 years. Yeah. These two have been mentors and tutors, and but nothing I say will be attributed to them. I'm sure.
25 years.
Okay. 20, yeah, that's true. So what I'm going to present really starts with what Ricky said, is that both the US and the UK have been defined by deep spatial disparities for long periods of time. I mean, here it is sort of London in the South versus the North. In the US, it's a collection of what we would call superstar cities, like San Francisco and LA and Seattle and Boston and New York, that have really captured the lion's share of venture capital and innovation for a long period of time. And you have an initiative, you have a department of leveling up. It really sounds like a Monty Python film, but it's what we have in the US, like most things in the US, doesn't really have a label. It has Build Back Better, I suppose, but no one really uses that anymore. What we have is a ton of money. And so I'm going to walk through this, and if it feels like a parallel universe from another stratosphere, that's what it feels like at home. So, buckle up for this. I mean, this is going to be an interesting ride. Let's see if I can move through slides. This one is not going to be basically this one is. Sure. That sort of just froze for a second. Yeah. Maybe I just. That. So which one do I choose that one? Yeah. Oh, perfect. Okay. Sorry about that. So first, I want to just start with a little bit of context, because we're human beings. We like to have some order to our life. So we're going to say, post-COVID, post-pandemic, we're reverting to a new normal. There is no normal anymore. what I'm really seeing both in the US, which might be an extreme, but around the world, is a new disorder. I mean, we are really seeing mega forces, some of which is coming from the pandemic, remote work, let's say, and work from home, some of which is coming from climate, long-standing kind of issues that have been addressed, some of what is coming from unprecedented federal spending itself, and some of what is coming from the war in the Ukraine and rising geopolitical tensions. And this last one probably has the longest effect of all of them. And so there was this great article in the New York Times about a year ago, actually, by Janice Miller, which basically said it's like you have a snow globe and just shake it up and nothing has settled yet, right? And I think when we look at what's happening in the US right now, with the Biden administration, you know, in sort of a 50-50 split of the politics, you know, I mean, he basically had small margins in the House of Representatives and 50-50 split in the Senate. They have made nation-shaping investments over the last 2 years, as we'll see, in manufacturing, climate, universities, infrastructure. They're just extraordinary, extraordinary. What they haven't done, which is interesting, and this gets to what the effect on cities will be, they haven't really met cities where they are. Cities are seeing central business districts collapse, and they're seeing dwindling tax bases, they're seeing a burst of crime and homelessness, declining public transit use. So this is an extraordinary thing. A Democratic president is making unprecedented investments in nation building, while cities are trying to adapt to some very difficult challenges. Now, as all this money begins to rain down, and I'll talk through the money in a bit, it's clear that cities and metros, more than the national government, are going to have to sort out delivery and design. The feds are just an investor, and they are setting the table for what they're investing in. But all the design and delivery is going to happen locally. And why is that? That's because cities are not really vertically organized the way the federal government is, or your government is. We have a Department of X, we have a Department of Y, we have a Department of Z. Cities are more horizontal networks, public, private, civic, working across multiple disciplines. They clearly are the engines of the national economy, disproportionately so, particularly the major ones. And they have multiple layers of power. And so in the US particularly, this is a self-organizing moment because our public sector is one of multiple players when you get down to the city or county or metropolitan level. We really are a network society. And so as all this funding begins to rain down, what you're seeing are networks of institutions and sectors begin to stand up and take advantage of it. So there is a base case for all these shifts and shocks, which is like lowest common denominator as we reshore, as we electrify the auto industry, as we have all this infrastructure funding and remote work and calls for equity post George Floyd. If we're not organized locally, this is just going to be one disjointed, disconnected mess, to tell you the truth. And we'll wake up several decades from now and say, we just spent trillions, what did we get for it? If we do organize locally, and again, I'll just keep saying local, because it's not the federal government that is going to organize this. They're just the investor. They have thrown the money over the fence and they've just run in the other direction, essentially, right? It's locals that are going to take control of all this and take these mega forces and adapt them to metropolitan reality in ways that have significant, innovative, inclusive, and sustainable effect. And herein lies really the genius of this plan, though, to tell you the truth, I'm not sure they really understood this. They are essentially saying to the US, to hundreds and hundreds of communities, cities and their suburbs together, if you get your act together, you can set a platform for the next 25 years. You can be in the vanguard of innovative, inclusive, and sustainable growth. If you don't get your act together, you'll be left behind. And you know what? That's your decision. That's the subtext of what's happening in the US.
Can you define reshoring?
So reshoring is essentially, the US is only about 8% of our workforce is in manufacturing. We have globalized, we have outsourced, we have offshored. for decades, mostly because Wall Street decided that that was the appropriated thing to do. Our supply chains have just extended all over the world so Wall Street can make another buck. That's changing, not just because of the pandemic, but because of the security threat with China. Let's know with Russia more with China. So we are reshoring technology production, particularly in semiconductors, back into the United States at scale, fast. But where that happens, whether it's connected to workforce, whether it's connected to Black and Latino firms, whether it's connected to housing, that's all locally driven. It's not driven by the feds. Let me give you a sense of this funding. So in Mount Olympus, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has basically said, we have modern supply side economics. And that somehow is going to connect up everything to push the country forward. Labor supply, human capital, infrastructure, R&D, investments in a sustainable environment. I mean, this is a brilliant theory. I mean, it really has framed and defined. And if you read the speeches of our Commerce Secretary, if you read the speeches of the National Economic Council or President Biden's speeches, himself, they just keep repeating this again and again. That's the big frame for the country. And then here's what's coming, right? Now, some of this is still a hangover from the Trump period. But as we think about the succession of bills and very large amounts of funding that are coming down from the federal government, the importance is to realize they're not going to the same recipients or beneficiaries. They're going to a very broad variety, an array of stakeholders. Again, sort of re-emphasizing the need to organize it locally. It just doesn't go to local government, right? It's, as you'll see, it's going to a lot of different players. So the CARES Act, which is essentially under President Trump, 1.9 trillion, was just to keep everyone alive, essentially, during COVID. It's the race to get to the vaccine. It's to prop up our small businesses. It's to help households maintain their incomes. Then we get to the first act of President Biden, the American Rescue Plan. That begins to expand the aperture of who is funded and supported by the national government. They've sent about $360 billion directly to states, cities, and counties with very few strings attached, either as a sort of a buffer against fiscal collapse, or you decide how you want to spend it to respond to the pandemic. Then they passed a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill to rebuild our roads and our bridges and our transit system and our water utilities and electric utilities and digital infrastructure. That doesn't go to local government, that goes to public authorities. Because we have an authority for everything in the US. We have water utilities and electric utilities and ports and airports and, mostly created in the 1950s as a way to deliver what was then a big infrastructure burst under President Eisenhower. So these are the three main bills that were either passed under Trump in 2020 and, or passed under President Biden in 2021. And so you can just see the array of the recipients and the beneficiaries as you begin to move through this. So, there is this sort of phrase called whole of government that I think you use in the UK. In the US, I think it's whole of society, because we're sending money directly to households, directly to firms, directly to governments. We're just sending it to everyone. So that's the CARES Act. This is the American Rescue Plan. Here's this big chunk of money that went to states, locals, state, city governments, and county governments. Large amounts of funding. They had not seen this kind of flexible funding since the 1970s under Jimmy Carter. And then a whole bunch of other stuff that continued from the CARES Act, essentially. And then you just get to the chaos of the infrastructure bill. Because in any given city, you have a city government, have a county government, and you may have a dozen or 20 or 25 public authorities plus school districts, all within your city and metropolitan area. So everyone talks about public-private partnership. In the US, we talk about public-public partnership because the public sector is so damn fragmented. To pull all this together, and we did this for the city of Philadelphia because the mayor was basically saying, where's all this money going? Well, it's just going to all these different authorities. Well, who's in charge of those authorities? Well, not really anyone, right? Everyone's in charge. No one's in charge. Welcome to America, right? That was the first bit of bills, 2021. Then in 2022, they passed the Chips and Science Act, which was basically might be seen, let's compete with China Act. And then they passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which should be seen as let's solve the climate crisis. No one ever calls anything what it really is in the US. So you call everything the Department of Leveling Up. We try to hide what's really going on so we can actually pass the legislation. Chips and Science, 280 billion. The focus of this bill are really manufacturing firms, private companies, to entice them to basically expand or locate in the United States, particularly around semiconductors. The Inflation Reduction Act is all really done through the tax side, to homeowners, to consumers, to manufacturers, to energy project developers, solar firms, wind firms, geothermal firms, utilities, and incredibly in a tax bill, there are also direct pay provisions. So you can actually have nonprofit institutions like universities and hospitals that can just convert these tax credits into funding to do whatever they're doing around energy efficiency and local grids and all this. So this is the wild, wild west. Inflation Reduction Act, enormous focus on energy supply to basically diversify our energy sources to renewables through the business sector, primarily through the business sector. So as you're sitting, at the local level, you're in City Hall, and all you're hearing about are climate action plans for cities. Well, this is a national climate action plan, basically focused on having the private sector, for the most part, design, finance, and deliver it. We can get more into how cities relate to this, but this is a fascinating exercise. And then we have our small Department of Defense, right? So I've been talking about trillions over, but most of the money for infrastructure or for climate are over 5 years, over 10 years. The annual budget of our Department of Defense is running towards $800 billion a year. And the military industrial complex in the United States, in terms of production facilities for the next generation of submarines or air fighters or tanks or drones or R&D centers to basically create the next generation technologies to support all that weaponry, is distributed all over our country, sometimes hidden behind bases, sometimes in plain sight. But this is a volume of funding now coming, not really to just replenish the weaponry we've sent to the Ukraine, but to get ready to basically dissuade China from invading Taiwan. At the NOAC lab, we have a funding tracker, which basically sends out a notice, usually on a day-to-day basis, of all the money that's flowing out of defense or energy or EPA or HUD or transportation. If you want to be completely overwhelmed, sign up for this thing. I guarantee within a week, you're just going to need a drink or something stronger because it just keeps coming. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of programs. This was not designed by anyone who actually understands how you might want to unify and integrate. It's just defined by folks who need to get a bill passed, essentially. Then we have our states, because we are not a country, really. We are a union of states. The states are doing their own thing. They have an enormous amount of their own funding. They are competing like crazy for these next industries, like electric vehicles. And they are putting centers of innovation, centers of research excellence into their cities, 100 million a pop. They are part of the luring of major global manufacturing firms, particularly around semiconductors. So they are part of the whole federal effort. And then they are dividing up their states. Like in California, they have 13 regions, called the California Economic Resilience Fund. Actually, the UK should probably do this. New York did it for 10 years. And they're figuring out a way to at least give cities, metros, and even rural areas the ability to come together and plan in some rational way for the economic future. So that's the funding plan, if you want to call it. They have over-indexed on nation building, and they have under-indexed on responding to cities. So just from a political economy perspective, you have a Democratic president, right, following the batshit crazy Trump years, right, that is essentially investing aspatially, for the most part, into rebuilding the competitiveness of the United States and decarbonizing our economy simultaneously, but not really focusing or meeting cities where they are. Really interesting, right? It's hard to imagine Lyndon Johnson doing this in the same way, but that's where we are, circa 2023. Okay, some early signals from the US. I'm just going to choose one program, a small little program, $1 billion. The Build Back Better Regional Challenge. This was a program out of the Department of Commerce, the Economic Development Administration. And we coached this out of Drexel. So we were part of a team that helped, as you'll see, certain winners, bulk up, strengthen their proposals. Basically, what the federal government said to anyone who wanted to apply is tell us what your advanced industry clusters are. Could be aerospace, it could be bio, they could be next generation energy. So just tell us what your advanced clusters are, what you're really good at, right? And then tell us what you need to get even better at that stuff. And we'll fund anywhere from 25, they said to 100 million, ultimately to about 65 million. So there's centers of excellence, workforce, infrastructure, site assembly, anything that could be sort of put towards your next generation cluster. And they went out, this was literally the only, this is taken from the Department of Commerce. They said, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about like a manufacturing cluster, a services cluster, and an ag tech cluster. So they said, you figure it out. Total devolution to the country to come back and say, hey, we're really good at this, and here's what we need to get even better at it. 529 applications came in from the country. They knocked it down to 60 phase one winners. These are the folks we coach. They gave them all $500,000 in technical assistance to get their applications buffed up further. Then they chose 21 places. This is who they chose all around the country. And just to go to the political economy of this, which states got 2? Oklahoma got 2. That's about as red a state as you're ever going to see. They tell me how you do it. And then New York State got 2. That's about as blue a state you're ever going to see. So the politics of this are really quite interesting. This was a merit-driven competition. Advanced mobility, ag, next generation manufacturing, particularly in aerospace, clean energy, and funding for the tribe. So very distributed across the country and very distributed across advanced industry sectors. And what we basically said in our coaching was, look, you've got to basically, as networks of universities, business leaders, governments, labor unions, the list goes on, networks, you've got to be thinking across all these elements: entrepreneurship, innovation, workforce, community regeneration, infrastructure, because the feds are incapable of thinking about this, right? So you've got to come back with a holistic plan and projects that really are intended to unlock your industrial strengths and then lead to some inclusive and sustainable growth. And the flexibility in this program, I'm sure for a UK audience, is extraordinary. They basically said brilliantly, look, you're closer to the ground, you have a better sense of your own economy, you figure it out and come back and tell us what you think. Interestingly enough, what they came back with were 3 different ideas about clusters, right? Because this was meant from the beginning to be about leveraging those clusters. The first was more of a traditional cluster, aerospace in Wichita, advanced mobility in Detroit. These advanced sectors have defined those metropolitan areas for decades, for generations. So not surprisingly, they came back with a full ecosystem of big companies and also the universities, the startups and scale-ups and all the rest. But then a group of places basically said, we're less focused on clusters in the traditional Michael Porter way and more about convergence around advanced technologies, artificial intelligence, which obviously cuts across all these sectors. The state of Georgia came back with Georgia Tech, not surprisingly, and said, we're going to focus on AI across all our manufacturing in the entire state. Very clever. And then another group of folks basically said, we're going to focus on clusters that don't really exist yet. The blue economy, you know, in New England or along the West Coast, or the hydrogen economy, which actually won out of New Orleans. So, you know, we're going to take a flyer on something that doesn't even really have a definition. So this national competition with enormous amount of flexibility, with very little guidance from the federal government. I mean, literally, when you read the guidance, you could drive a truck through this thing, right? But that was the intent. Well, let the country figure it out. And let's see what they come back with. So they did come back with some traditional clusters, like Wichita, like Detroit, but really thinking about the next generation of a traditional cluster, and particularly thinking about how to involve more Black and Latino workers in these advanced industries because of the wage premium, or Black and Latino firms, small and medium-sized enterprises. The converging clusters is really Georgia. Really thinking about, this is more industry 4.0. Again, in the US, we don't really have the same kind of intellectual framework for all this stuff. I mean, you know, to find a conference on this thing is a heroic act, right? I mean, we're just sort of doing things and then trying to explain them later, you know, sort of, you know, invest first, ask questions later. But this Georgia Tech, Carnegie Mellon, they get the way the world's going. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, this is blowing through multiple sectors. So that was their idea. And then, you know, Fresno, Alaska, New Orleans, they're all into where the clean economy is going and trying to get their piece of that action and be at the vanguard, be the inventors of it, as opposed to just the consumers of what someone else does. So this was all quite, oh, I just screwed something. Cheryl O'Connor host. What do I do now? Oh my God. Oh my God. Cheryl.
Be there, Alec.
Oh my God. That was classic. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this one worked.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Another group of cities, and this is really important because in the US, a country that's so damn large, what you want to get ultimately is to models, to norms, to routines that can be codified and then blow through the country, you know, and be plagiarized by every other city. So Buffalo comes in and basically says, we're going to put a manufacturing workforce center on the east side of Buffalo, completely distressed, completely disadvantaged. But that means all the suburban-oriented manufacturing firms will have to come to the east side of Buffalo to get training for their workers. And, you know, because it's the east side of Buffalo, there's a larger propensity for African-American residents to basically move into advanced manufacturing. Everyone's now talking about the Northland model, you know, because when you don't really have a playbook, you just immediately seize on a model and try to just repeat it. Then we go to St. Louis, same kind of idea. St. Louis is basically backed by the Boeing Corporation. The Boeing Corporation is one of our biggest producers of advanced fighter jets and drones, right? All suburban, all by the airports, both on the Missouri side and on the Illinois side. But they came back and said, we want to do an advanced manufacturing innovation center in the north side of St. Louis, the most disadvantaged, the most distressed, you know, 98% African-American part of the city and metropolis. So they ticked a lot of boxes, right? Locational equity, workforce.
Who is they?
I
mean, when you say
Boeing, the business community,
business,
St. Louis University, University of Missouri, St. Louis Community College, St. Louis Economic Development Partnership in the county, St. Louis Development Corporation, everyone and their mother, basically. I mean, you know, because what the Fed said is no individual organization could come up with this. So come up with a network. You guys decide what the network is. We don't know what's going on in your city, but you figure it out. So this thing is becoming, by the way, all this came from Sheffield because Boeing backs the Sheffield Advanced Manufacturing Research Center and has been wanting to build an advanced manufacturing research center in the United States. They now have federal money to do it, right? And finally is El Paso. El Paso is on the border with Mexico, 85% Hispanic, another military-oriented defense production hub. What they've been trying to do with the University of Texas at El Paso, so again, the university led with the business community, is to take a large number of Latino firms that are now in the civilian side of the economy and move them into the military side of the economy. So they're building this massive El Paso Makes Advanced Manufacturing District right by the airport and are taking Latino firms through the rigor of both upgrading their workers, upgrading their business models, accessing federal procurement, and all the rest. By the way, the Department of Defense is the only agency in the United States that has a small business strategy. I mean, more than the Small Business Administration. You know, we usually, if you want to know where things really happen, don't go to an agency with that name. Go to another agency where it's more likely to be happening. So then we get to, here we go. Here are a couple things that come from this whole exercise. Because everyone's using their Build Back Better proposals, again, dozens and dozens of places apply to now get ready for all the other money that's coming. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We're all making this up as we're going along, is the bottom, right? There's too much money coming. If you think too long about anything, you're going to miss the deadlines. So just good enough for government work, right? Let's get the applications in. Divide and conquer, figure out who knows what the hell's going on in your community. Community colleges are really good at customized skills training. Let them be in charge of workforce, right? Let some of these business intermediary groups or the universities be in charge of other stuff. So divide and conquer. You can't have one entity doing everything. It's a network. Do the math. It's a math problem, right? We have large transformative initiatives. Public subsidy, bank debt, private equity, philanthropic funding. Give us a capital stack. Give us uses and sources. Let's just keep going, right? So let's do the math. Let's be project focused. Let's not dream about stuff that's abstract and vague. Let's write it down. And then meet to decide, not to discuss. We have tables like this around the US everywhere. There are community engagement tables, there are stakeholder tables, and we discuss ad infinitum all the wrongs of the world and how terrible everything is. What basically the federal government is, let's park that for a year or two, just decide what to do, right? Then we can get back to the deliberation later. So really interesting kind of signals coming from the national government. Speed, urgency, move. We got climate, we got national security, get your act together. And, you know, the federal government, when we talk about interagency collaboration, is essentially impossible, right? It's an unnatural act between non-consenting adults. It's not going to happen, right? It's at the local level that this is going to happen. So what does this all mean? Let's see if this still works. I'm going to skip that. Okay, lessons for the UK. Devolution really matters. I mean, the UK have been talking about this for a long time, but this ability to self-organize in the US is because we are a federated republic and because we both have devolved down powers to cities and counties and states and all of that. But we've also created a culture where different actors can take risk, right? And ask for forgiveness, not permission. So no one is going to a federal agency and please, sir, some more. They're just doing. It's a culture as much as a formal governance structure. Networks matter. Cities are not governments. They are not governments. They are networks. That's why the US is able to respond this way. If we think of cities as just a long arm of a central government, we have failed to recognize their true power. They are markets, they are market players, and therefore they are this collection of mature companies, startups and scale-ups, SMEs, universities, all the rest. And cumulative impact really matters. So if you have that North Star, we are going to be at the vanguard of the next generation of aerospace or of electric car production. By necessity, you are forced to then look at, well, that's interesting. What about road? What about transit? What about energy? What about water? What about sewer? What about all this other separately compartmentalized delivery systems, which now need to be put into service of this big North Star? So what's happening is, the federal government is just raining down money, manna from heaven, right? But all the organizing is happening locally, usually towards some big idea, right? Which is usually economic focused. And Americans get very excited about the next generation of everything. So that's sort of what's happening. I mean, it's really brilliant in many ways. Here's the problem. The problem is we basically have spent the last 30 years globalizing, outsourcing, and offshore, right? So we've lost our muscle memory in many parts of the country to really imagine an industrial-led future, right? We have no planning around stuff. I mean, like literally no planning. We plan to basically downsize the industrial economy, not to upsize it. In fact, the Advanced Manufacturing Innovation Center in St. Louis came out of the Department of Defense grant that was meant to help St. Louis respond to Boeing cutting employment, not adding employment. So we quickly have to move in a very different way. A lot of manufacturing, production, or related industries are suburban. They're not cities. They're not in the urban areas, because a lot of these firms are looking for vast space. Semiconductors, 1,000 acres a pop, right, with access to water. So we've got to think through how to ground these very distributed manufacturing ecosystems in the cores of metropolitan areas with workforce diversity, with supplier diversity, with applied research. Capacity. If you want to build back better, you better bulk up capacity. We have degraded the public sector for decades in the US since Reagan. We have nonprofits that barely can manage themselves out of a paper bag. And now suddenly we have trillions coming. So you got to bulk up capacity, both individually within governments, affiliated intermediaries, and then in a wholesale way, almost like circuit riders from city to city that can help and, help plan and deliver. And in the military, we are remilitarized. The only thing I can think of the equivalent to this is the 1940 as we got prepared for the Second World War, and the 1950s as we began to prepare for the Cold War. We're entering a new Cold War, so hopefully, and we were remilitarized. But these military factories and complexes and facilities usually sit behind a fence. So people say, where is that place? Oh yeah, you go down I-935 and you go 40 miles. Oh yeah, that's where it is. We need to begin to get, and the military is very open to this. The Defense Department is very open. Get folks out behind the fence to come into the cores of cities and be part of a broader, inclusive and sustainable regeneration. So the US ain't perfect. Don't try this at home, kind of thing. But it is remarkable exercise in nation building, funded from the national level, to some extent from the states, but completely driven from the bottom up. I mean, completely driven from the bottom up. The federal government is not going to build any of these things. They're just going to get behind it, undergird it, support it, and ultimately leverage it. So that's the bit, and then I'm not touching anything, but
Thanks very much. I'm going to go to Anne in a moment. I was struck until the very last slide where I don't think you mentioned the word planning for city mayors up until the end, which just in terms of, if you think of the UK context where, none of this could be happening without major investment in planning, whatever that means, and no doubt come to that. It just struck me that was not part of the language, but you explain why that is.
Our idea of planning is lunch. That's how far out we think. But that's part of the problem.
Exactly.
And now suddenly, overnight, we need to plan.
Mm.
But for projects, principally. For projects, yes.
Where you locate those projects are not insignificant. Anne, are you showing slides or?
No, I'm not.
No,
I'm just
okay.
talking. So Bruce and I we've had long chats since 1996, actually, on the when Bruce first started talking about the evils of sprawl, and we were doing a study in the north of England, in Manchester and Newcastle, on the problems of urban abandonment. And Patrick Dunleavy of this LSE said to me, if we're not very careful, we're going to face the American problem of abandonment, which is impossible. So I suppose what I want to talk about is how levelling up in the US and the UK is like comparing chalk and cheese. We're just not in the same world, let alone, the same space. So it's incredibly enlightening to hear about the US. But we have to remember, as Ricky pointed out at the beginning, that the US is a continent, Europe is a continent, and Britain is this itsy bitsy little island. America's got over 50 states. We've got 4 countries, 2 of which are less than 2 million people each. So we are the itsy bitsy place. We're only 20 miles from Europe, and we think we're the greatest thing since sliced bread, bit of a mistake. So the US population is nearer to Europe's total. And so the comparisons just don't wear really. Also, the US has a federal structure, and we sort of began to try with devolution to move gently, very gently in that direction. But we know that it's been a very weak thing because we've got huge problems in Northern Ireland, and we've got huge problems in Scotland with the independence movement, and Wales goes its own gang. The other thing that is really seriously different is that Britain has old cities, like very old cities. So many of our former industrial cities, like Manchester and Newcastle, are actually Roman cities. They were actually founded in Roman times. And we haven't to forget that, because some of our sort of basic layering of cities is based on that. Most of our ports were either set up by the Romans or set up by the Vikings. So the whole sort of development of the UK as an old urban industrial country is kind of fundamentally, I suppose ingrained is the best way I can put it, because we don't actually have the space to change it. And that's another issue. So America has 25 times the land space for every single human being that lives in America, and it's a huge country that we have. So when they, when you show that El Paso development, 1,000 acres, I mean, it's unthinkable in this country that we could do anything like that. I mean, it's just totally beyond thinking. I mean, what this is doing to the United States environment is nobody's question. And Bruce hasn't really, he put up climate change about 3 times in a little box, but he didn't actually challenge the viability of some of these proposals in terms of the environmental impact of them, just on the United States. But here you can't actually do it. It's just completely physically impossible. Because when you sprawl in Britain, this was where I first got interested in Bruce's work. When you sprawl in America, you increase the commuting time by a long way. When you sprawl here, you just bump into the next place. I mean, it's actually not possible to do it. And that's why we set up green belts. And that's why, of all the things that I don't love greatly about Conservatives, I love their love of green belts. If we didn't have green belts, I honestly don't know where we would be today, but it's a hugely sensitive issue that you try to actually build on non-built on land in this country. So the people who really want to build on land say, well, we've only built on 13% of the land, but actually 70% of the land in England is under development impact. That means it's either roads, or it's energy supplies, or it's water supplies, or it's rubbish disposal, or it's freight transport, or it's storage, or it's whatever. So in fact, we have very little land left. The land left is mainly very rocky and the Pennines, basically, that's it. So we're stuck. We have no land. We can't, if we were going to be sensible, we would say we can't build on another metre of Greenland from here on. And so that makes it really, really impossible to sprawl. And it makes the threat of urban abandonment, which we really thought was real in 1996, no longer what we're really worried about. What we're worried about is how on earth we make these places actually usable again. So everything here is about how we reuse, and the work that I did with Bruce on small cities, feeding cities, which was basically, can cities be reborn again? The difference between the US and Europe was basically how we actually reuse space, how we reuse our infrastructure, how we make our rail networks, which are huge, vast. I mean, Britain has the densest rail network in the whole world. We have the most fantastic rail network, which we neglect very seriously, which is terrible. And that's what makes our urban neighborhoods so valuable. So exactly the things that you're neglecting, you don't neglect here, because if you neglect them, you're neglecting the whole population. Everything sinks, you can't do it. So leveling up itself is just a very, very different type of animal. The other reason that it's very different, which is obvious to everybody from Bruce's talk, and I have to say on this, we have to be green with envy, it's just this huge United States funding with a massive commitment to spending on upping the ante, saying this is what we're prepared to provide and you get on with it. I mean, if only that would happen here, that would just be so majestic. We have the complete opposite. So we've had since 2010, which is now 13 years nearly, austerity and cuts. We've had a long period of everything going in the negative direction, whether it's support for low incomes, whether it's support for housing, whether it's support for infrastructure, whether it's support for jobs, whether it's support for skills, whether it's support for the health service, whatever it is, it's all on this kind of negative, well, not all, but almost all on a negative trajectory. And that's why our infrastructure is in such trouble. And that's why, I don't know, I know Bruce isn't following our news very carefully, he told me last night. But I mean, we've got nothing but strikes. We've got civil service strikes, we've got teacher strikes, we've got nurses strikes, we've got doctor strikes, we've got rail workers strikes, we've got bus workers strikes, we've got port workers strikes, we've got passport workers strikes. Any others? Can anybody suggest anyone? I mean, basically, we're in trouble. We're in big trouble. We're in big trouble. And so if only we were in your sort of place, it would be quite nice. We'd be so good at using it because we're a kind of dense, crowded country that really likes our cities. I mean, we could do brilliantly all the things that you're finding difficult. We do really, really well if only you give us a bit more cash. Anyway, and then on top of that, we've got Brexit. So we are nearest trading partners, and there's no way that we can do this onshoring that Bruce is talking about. I mean, the government, our government does talk about the equivalent of onshoring, but I mean, it's just ridiculous because we are part of Europe. We are part of a very multi-complex and very linked together economy, which we decided to kick in the teeth. I mean, how stupid is that? There we were in difficulty, and then we kick the people who help us most in the teeth. Brilliant. Okay, so in spite of that, there has been some levelling up, and I think it's worth mentioning. I've got 3 places that I can mention. I haven't got time to go into any detail, but Manchester. So for 20 years, Manchester had a chief executive who worked tirelessly, this is Manchester City Council, with the 9 other Manchester authorities of the metropolitan area of Greater Manchester, in order for those 10 local authorities to be able to work together. And when the government started talking, having pulled off some devolution to the countries, to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, started talking about some devolution to the cities. The one city that was ready and up for devolution was Greater Manchester, because it had this ability to combine 10 local authorities, which is not easy. I mean, Rochdale and Oldham hate each other. I mean, Stockport really loathes Salford. Salford and Manchester are enemies, but, you know, they work together. They've agreed to work together. And Manchester, as a result, is a completely different place than what it was 15 years ago. So 15 years ago, it was your desolate place where you walked along the main streets of central Manchester and saw nobody. And now, I mean, the city population has regrown massively. And a lot of industry has come back, a lot of foreign investment has come in, a huge amount of building has gone on. I'm from Manchester. So that the second city is Hull, and I think Hull is the most extraordinary story because it's come by chance. Hull is on the Humber, which is one of the big rivers, and so it was very famous for shipbuilding, famous for coal, famous for imports and exports, and it went into massive decline. And it did suffer from urban abandonment in a very big way. And then Siemens, the big German international infrastructure investment engineering company, was looking for a place where it could build its wind turbines for offshore wind. And it needed a very deep river. It needed a huge derelict industrial infrastructure, in other words, that could be reused. And it chose Hull. As a result of which, Hull has gone through a massive recovery, and it's building the 175 meters, I think they are, span turbines for offshore wind, because they have to be so close to the sea that the turbines won't be damaged from where they're manufactured to where they're stuck on the turbines. And so Hull has gone through a huge recovery, almost, no, you couldn't say by accident because it's by geography, but if you link the Humber and Hull to its past, I bet you it was a Viking port. I'd like to lay my bottom down. I don't know that, I'm guessing, but it must be. And it's very nice that it's now offshore wind. And just by the way, Britain has the highest level of wind speed of any European country, and it has the highest level of offshore wind production of any country in the world. So our advanced manufacturing is actually going quite well from that. That's the second city. The third city is Newcastle, which again was a huge shitting centre. Sorry, everybody.
That was a pulse.
Again, the Tyne is one. I think the Tyne and the Mersey are the two deepest rivers in the country. I mean, we're very well placed for ports because of these rivers, which allow big ships to come in. And Newcastle was a huge shipbuilder, which all collapsed when shipbuilding moved to Singapore and places like that. And interestingly, I don't quite know how it happened in Newcastle, except that they're very gutsy in Newcastle, and they just held on and held on and held on. And bit by bit, because of their advanced manufacturing skills, which is slightly the opposite story from what you're saying about the US, those advanced manufacturing skills didn't die out. I bet universities kept going on their engineering courses, and the dock areas couldn't be removed. What else were you going to do with the banks of the Tyne? I mean, they're very deep and you can't do anything with them. And so bit by bit, the sort of high level shipping technology has started to move back into Newcastle. And the centre of Newcastle is completely transformed. And the banks of the Tyne are likewise completely transformed. Yeah. So there has been a return of manufacturing. The same would apply to Sheffield and Belfast. If we try and measure income and how much productivity we can gain and how much extra value we can add, then I think levelling up with these cities and say London is impossible. But if we did level up with London, then I think, you know, we just be killing the country. So I think it's a lot better to think that advanced manufacturing hasn't lost out. We do still have those skills. That's why Boeing relocated to Sheffield, because it still had that engineering base, which then led to the St. Louis initiative. And as a result, we won't level up. We definitely won't replace or upgrade our infrastructure with the current government. But we do have the kind of basic framework for making it work better. And I think that Bruce's lessons of devolution and local powers, networking and multiple partnerships, and targeting the poorest areas, which I take to be the meaning of your cumulative thing, would actually be hugely helpful. So I do think there are three lessons that we could draw from Bruce's mostly inapplicable description of what's going on in America. And I think the can-do approach of Americans is to be envied. And just by the way, because Bruce, Ricky mentioned about bricks being his business and communities being mine. I am doing a book called Beyond Bricks and Mortar precisely to make that argument. Thank you, everybody.
And maybe we should, thank you. Just to be clear, your analysis of the spatial and historical geography of this country, right, lends itself or does not lend itself to leveling up? I mean,
It doesn't lend itself to levelling up.
right, because you use three
Because,
pretty,
well, first of all, because the infrastructure is so different. I mean, London is run as a financial centre, as a service centre, as a banking centre, and it does have
Right.
ancillary industrial areas, and it does have lots of poor areas because you need a lot of low-income workers in order to keep all of that
Okay.
going.
maybe Bruce,
But, you know, but for 250 years, most of the rest of the country was churned up with this hugely polluting, hugely damaging, hugely rich enhancing industrial
Bruce,
development.
how do you react to what?
I mean,
About the spatial?
I think in terms of what Anne's saying, is you have these, long-standing advantages in many of these northern cities and broader areas that actually can be unlocked now, can be leveraged. But it took Siemens to come into Hull to do that, and God knows what the hell happened in Newcastle. And it's sort of like, so in many ways, the leveling up agenda that's being driven by the government is not really starting from some of these, very strong, distinctive assets. It's just starting with, oh, let's throw this project in that place,
Okay, I'm going to stop, make sure that Mark.
Oh, okay.
No, because in a way, we talked about the level of investment, federal, and how it lands
Yeah.
in the state. You raised very clearly the issue that the UK geography is fundamentally different, and why don't we get some more money? And Mark is going to tell us how much money we're getting, and a bit more.
Yes, absolutely. And I was talking a little bit about devolution as well. And I have to say, hearing your description there of the chaos that's being caused by having too much power and too much money for some of the cities, I think that's not a problem we have here. Certainly, usually summarise it by saying there's not enough power and not enough money for cities. I'm just going to give a few reflections quickly so we can move on to some discussion from a paper that I wrote with colleagues here at LSE, including Max Herbertson, about the UK government's levelling up white paper, which we called our paper Level Best. And we did a few things with that paper. One was to try and understand what the UK government actually meant by levelling up, because it certainly wasn't clear at that point. It's probably not clear now either. And then we critiqued it along three lines, along its evolution, sort of funding that's attached to levelling up, and also the spatial targeting, which comes back to the point you were just making. So one of the reasons that the levelling up white paper was awaited was because levelling up was previously used as a sort of classic Johnsonian boosterist phrase that meant everything to everybody all at once, and it really wasn't clear exactly what levelling up meant. And the white paper did give us some clearer definitions about ending geographic inequality, which was a feature of the UK, but it also again tried to give everything to everybody. It spoke about inter-regional inequalities, but also intra-regional inequalities, and devoted a 48-page appendix to how levelling up would happen in every part of the UK, including London, which perhaps we wouldn't necessarily think needed levelling up. And the levelling up phrase itself, of course, is carefully used to allude to the idea of inequality, but to counter any concerns that there might be amongst particularly conservative politicians and others about the fact that levelling up might mean that reducing inequality might involve reducing the economic performance of London. And that's clearly not what's in this strategy, albeit there's some talk about tilting some of the funding that government provides away from London. Where to is another question. But there were three things we analysed, as I say, devolution, funding, and spatial targeting. So in terms of devolution, the white paper proposed what it called radical devolution proposals, and so the ideal really of the government's devolution framework is the Greater Manchester model. So lots of you will be familiar with the Greater Manchester Combined Authority and Andy Byrne, who's the directly elected mayor of Manchester. So the ideal that the government proposed was directly elected mayor covering a functional economic area, combining existing local authorities together to cover an economic area, and to give more control to those directly elected mayors over local transport, adult education, policing, and spatial planning. However, there was no real proposal in there for any fiscal devolution or much flexibility over spending beyond what was provided to it by in terms of like grants by central government, and also a real emphasis on accountability mechanism as well. So those of you, I worked in local government in the 2000s, and there was the ever-present audit commission that we had in local government that we had to regularly write reviews for about what we were doing and why we were doing it and meeting targets. We have public sector agreements, which were essentially targets that local government had to meet. And so the white paper sort of seems to replicate these kind of mechanisms of local government being arms of the central states that have to be held accountable to the priorities of central government. So for us, in terms of our critique, we think that the government's proposals are limited by this lack of fiscal devolution and the emphasis on accountability. And in order to be sort of really genuinely radical, we want some more genuine tax raising powers for local governments so that they could meet their own priorities. That there should be a real fundamental rethink of the relationship between local governments and central government. So local government is still very much thought of as a delivery arm of the central states, I think, and we may be moving away from that a little bit with the greater devolution to places like Greater Manchester, but I think that's still ingrained in the way that central government works. But also there needs to be real investment in local capacity for local governments as well if devolution goes to work. I'll talk a little bit about funding in a minute, but in general, local government's room for manoeuvre has been restricted for a very long time. If we want to give it freedom, there needs to be explicit and purposeful investment in building capacity back up of local government. So on funding, we analysed sort of direct government transfers to subnational bodies. In fact, Matt did a lot of this work. Thank you, Matt. So put me straight if I get any of this wrong. So in the recent budget announcement, just a few weeks ago, the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities proudly trumpeted that its total amount of levelling up funding currently amounts to £11 billion. So if we kind of roughly times that by 10 to get up to a US scale, say, we're talking about 100 billion, say. So we can see how way off the sort of money, sort of amounts that you're talking about in the US, this is, and that's over many years. We were a bit more generous. We got up to about 30 billion if you added lots of other things in. But still, that's way off the script on that. And also, of course, local government really suffered under austerity in the 2010s. I think Eric Pickles has a lot to answer for this, but he was a particularly zealous minister in the 2010 government. But local government, depending on how you measure it, had about 25% per capita cuts to funding. So we, back in the envelope, we reckon that over the decade that levelling up is reckoned to operate, that amounts to 130 billion less in funding than local government would have done given those cuts. It stacks up against the 30 billion if you're really generous that it might get from levelling up. So it's really not filling the hole that's been made just by the existing cuts, let alone going on over. On top of that, there's massive fragmentation of the funding landscape. So we identified 21 different funding streams administered by 9 different central government departments just over the 4-year period from 2018 to 2022. So really there needs to be a step change in the volume of funding for levelling up if we're going to make it work, and also think about how it's delivered. Finally, just very briefly, we've also looked at geographic targeting. And as I said, there's this 48 pages in the white paper that shows how levelling up is happening everywhere. And we basically found that there's no real explicit geographic strategy at all. It's and you may disagree, but there's very little attempt to say this place is our key strength. In a key sector, we want to build up this place. It's spreading money all over the place, very small amounts, some of which is for rebuilding adult education, some of which is for subsidising the bus service. There's no real kind of strong economic strategy and spatial prioritisation. So that's something that really needs building as well, we think. Anyway, I'll stop there so that we can more discussion. And obviously, things have moved on a little bit since then with 3 prime ministers that we since that point, which we can talk about later on. So.
Thanks, Mark. Can I suggest that we started a bit late, and there's wine and drinks here anyway, so you may want to stay. So why don't we continue a bit more beyond 5 o'clock? Allow some, but some of you will have planned to leave at 5 o'clock, so we understand if you do. But we might just continue a little bit more to have the conversation. Bruce, I'm just wondering whether you want to pick up immediately on some of the points, the 3 areas that Mark has just.
I mean, I think I'm taking lots of notes here because, we don't have a lot of analysis of what's happening in the U.S. right now. I mean, most of the folks that I engage with, having worked in the Clinton administration and Obama administration, do not want to criticize what the Biden administration is doing, because the other side is not an opposition party. They're just a bunch of crazy people. So, we don't really have, and that's not a partisan comment, that's an objective comment. So I think there's just not a lot of analysis along the line that you're describing. That's what we're trying to fill in here. But in the US, it's more like just salute and deliver. And and we don't really have an explicit strategy beneath modern supply economics, whatever the hell that means, and build back better, whatever that means. We don't really have this kind of explicit. I mean, you literally have to go through speeches and speeches to find maybe one sentence from the Treasury Secretary or the Commerce Secretary. Oh, and by the way, this will reduce spatial disparities. Okay, so I'm really looking forward to reading this in more depth, because I mean, it may help us find the kind of more rigor and methodology to do our own assessment back in the US. Yeah.
I think, well, Tony Travers, probably everyone knows in the room, comment here and then.
Yeah, it's such an interesting discussion. I think we build on something that Anne said, because this policy in the UK, I mean, as ever, the fateful ease we see in the US and the UK being so like each other, we lead across, and as Anne was rightly saying, it is, I think, on this particular policy, even more difficult than normal. I think partly this does come up in the United States with its reserve currency and its remarkable capacity to borrow. So huge sums of money. And the UK is in exactly the opposite. We've got trend growth, which has since 2008 dropped from 2.5% to 1.5%. We're living through the only government since 1955 when real living household disposable income was 4. So levelling up is all about trying to do this at the moment when it just means incomes falling less in your area, not growing. Okay, that's where we've got to. Okay, with none of and the fact is that the Liz Truss government showed beyond argument how